Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It's an exciting week. We have had the privilege to have many people coming here talking and sharing their views, but this is really special. We have the great honor to have the very first presentation of a joint report today produced by WTO, IMF, the World Bank Group, and OECD. So pop your popcorn because this is a premiere. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at Peterson, and I will be moderating the event today. So the report, and it's all over the place, this one, Working Together for Better Climate Action, very topical subjects on carbon pricing, policy spillovers, and global climate goals. In a world where we desperately need more multilateral cooperation because we have so many joint challenges, this is highly appropriate, I would say. So we will begin with some opening remarks from Dr. Bright Okugu, who is Chief of Staff at the Director General's office at WTO in Geneva. After that, we'll have a panel, and I will introduce them all at the same time. We have Mr. Eddie Beckers, who is Counselor at the Economic Research and Statistics Divisions at WTO. He will present the report. And after that, we will have the four organizations who have been contributing to discuss here at the podium. We have Ruud de Mooij, who is Deputy Director at IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. We have Álvaro Santos Pereira, who is Chief Economist and G20 Finance Deputy of OECD. We have Indermit Gill, who is Chief Economist at the World Bank Group. And we have Mr. Ralph Ossa, who is Chief Economist at WTO. And for those of you who've been following the events here, you have seen some of them already on stage. But first of all, let me introduce Dr. Okugu. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let me start by thanking the Peterson Institute for hosting us, for agreeing to host us at such short notice. And Director General Ngozi said, you are miracle workers. Because when we started this, we were not sure whether we'd be able to get the place for this. But you have proven her to be correct, that you are indeed, well, not quite in the Christian way that you see it, but indeed, we are very grateful. Thank you very much. I want to welcome all of you to this formal event, this launching of our report. By way of background, the Task Force on Carbon Pricing, which is made up of the IMF, OECD, the World Bank, and WTO, along with UNCTAD, and of course a bit later on UNFCCC. This was set up by a mandate of the IMFC Ministers of Finance at the annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF about a year ago in Marrakesh. Presently, there are about 78 fragmented approaches to managing or pursuing the net zero objective, which is very costly to companies because all of them, not all of them, most of them who come to us have actually flagged this as a major difficulty for them. We should also obviously identify the fact that small and medium enterprises are at a great disadvantage when it comes to having the reporting that you need in order to comply with some of the many approaches that we have around the world. So this work is part and parcel of how we might be able to support them to ease the difficulty that they all face if we are able to get to a common framework for carbon pricing globally. Since the establishment of the Joint Task Force, we have worked, I would say, very, very assiduously to try to produce this report that we are launching today. And I have to say that it has been very rewarding, but not very, very easy task. I'm sure that all the colleagues here who participated we had times when we really, really stretched ourselves in order to try and reach a bit of a compromise on small issues. And those small issues, if you don't solve them, you don't get anywhere. I would say that the heads of our various organizations have been extremely supportive of the work. Sometimes they have had to speak to each other to bridge some of the divides that we experienced. And I want to use this opportunity to thank them for being steadfast and having the confidence, I would say, in the team to get us to where we have reached. I've been present in some of the negotiations among the heads, just to be able to push us forward at some point or the other. The impression I had was that they really have a clear picture in their minds how they want this work to be done. They are very ambitious that this could actually contribute a great deal to some of the major challenges on climate change and net zero pursuit that the whole world is now working towards. The task force, we came from different backgrounds, and I can tell you that it was not easy, but I want to thank everybody, all the IOs, for their flexibility that they displayed and determination to see this to the end. I also want to thank specifically our colleagues who worked, the technical team, who worked, some of them, or most of them, behind the scenes, actually. You don't see them, but they were doing all of the very, very hard technical work to get us to where we have reached. And I want to thank them specifically for this. This first report is not perfect by any means, but we are very proud to have been able to produce this version of it, this report, because it is essentially a negotiation among all of the participating international organizations coming from different backgrounds, and being able to come up with a report of this type, I think is very, very valuable, and I want to thank all of them. We are hopeful that we can deepen this work in a subsequent stage, second report, second effort, to enable us to deliver a bit more substantive work on the technical side when we start to do it. Now, the report covers different areas, ranging from an assessment of the current gap between that we have between where we are and the Paris Agreement's objectives, recognizing the different approaches towards achieving the net zero, agreeing a common set of metrics. I think this particular one is very important. You need to know what you are measuring, what you are trying to control, by having a common approach towards measuring. Otherwise, you will not make much of a progress. Now, I have to say that the other areas, possible spillover effects arising from policies, scaling up of ambition in order to get us to where we all want to get to. There are a number of problems, potential difficulties with emerging climate policies, including trade tensions, which we are all very familiar with, particularly from the WTO side, market access, competition, level playing field issues, economic growth, and so on and so forth. This work should hopefully contribute towards helping to resolve some of these difficulties. Our colleague, Eddie Beckers from the WTO, will be presenting on behalf of everybody. This is by common agreement. This will be followed by a more detailed discussion by our expert panel. And when I look at the panelists, I said to myself, this is a really, really rich panelists. In fact, if you take a simple average, it's well over 100 years of experience collectively. However, as economists, if you were to weight these years by the depth of their knowledge and experience, my rough calculation shows about 525 years. So we are in for a treat, for a treat this afternoon, and I want to thank them for their participation. And our moderator, thank you very much. You started us on a very good note, and we're looking forward now to getting the show underway. Thank you, everybody, and welcome.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Bright. So I'm going to try to present the report in 15 minutes. So as Dr. Bright has already mentioned, we have 5 international organizations, and we have the report Working Together for Better Climate Action, Carbon Pricing, Policy Spillovers, and Global Climate Goals. So what is the background of this report, and what are the objectives of the report? We know that countries are scaling up climate action, and this is enabled by the approach that we have under the Paris Agreement, where countries have differences in ambition, differences in policy approaches, also differences in policy sequences. However, what we see in the Paris Agreement is that there is a gap between the collective goal to reach 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming and the individual pledges and implementation that we see in the NDC. So therefore, more needs to be done to receive emission reduction targets. However, achieving these emission reduction targets is complicated by 2 main barriers. First of all, the political feasibility of certain policies and also distributional concerns related, for example, to carbon pricing. And secondly, also, we know that all these climate policies, they come with cross-border spillover effects. For example, carbon pricing, but that is also for subsidies to promote decarbonization. So with that background, the WTO decided to convene this task force on climate action, carbon pricing, and policy spillovers, which was joined by the IMF, the OECD, UNCTAD, and the World Bank. So what contributions does the report make? We see 4 main contributions. First of all, we try to we're introducing a common understanding of carbon pricing metrics. Secondly, we analyze the appropriate or best mix of climate mitigation policies with a crucial or very important role for carbon pricing. Thirdly, we analyze the coordination that is needed to manage the cross-border spillover effects and to actually try to maximize positive spillovers and limit negative spillovers. And finally, we analyze the role of international coordination in scaling up climate action. So let me talk you through each of these components in turn. Before that, I should mention that in the report, we focus only on mitigation and we do not focus on adaptation. That is not because we think adaptation is not important, but putting a report together only on climate change mitigation has already been rather complicated, so we decided to focus on this topic. Okay, so let me start with, before going into the policy actions, some background. What is the state of global climate action? First of all, we know that increased action is needed. The objectives, what are the objectives? So the global stocktake by the UNFCCC, for example, has taken over calculations arguing that we need 43% reductions by 2030 and 60% by 2035 relative to 2019. However, if we look at the current NDC's calculations, for example, by UNEP, they would indicate that the current NDCs only would reduce emissions by 9%, instead of the 43% needed in 2030. Then there is also an implementation gap because actually in a business as usual scenario, the IMF has calculated that emissions would go up by 5% instead of going down by 9% as announced in the NDC. Finally, in increasing climate action, climate finance plays a crucial role, and there is a whole range of calculations that indicate that there is also a gap in the amount of climate finance. Okay, so if we look at the state of global climate action, we see that there is a range of policy instruments. So first we have explicit and implicit carbon pricing, then we have the incentive-based policies, then countries also introduce standards and regulations, and finally what is also important is investments and other policies. What is important to observe is that we shouldn't think of climate change mitigation as only generating costs, because low emission pathways can actually also help to promote economic growth, and they can also help with achieving various sustainable development goals. Yeah, so that is something that we also explicitly discuss in the report. So if we look at these policy mixes here, a chart taken from research by the OECD, we see that there is quite a bit of variation across countries in the policy mixes, in the policy mixes employed. Yeah, and we see the different categories that I have listed. So explicit and implicit carbon pricing in blue, in green incentive-based policies, in yellow other investments, and finally in red standards and regulations. And so we see that some countries rely much more on carbon pricing, whereas others, they tend to rely much more on standards. Then if we look at specifically at carbon pricing, this is the work by the World Bank, the global carbon pricing or global carbon price dashboard. We see that the coverage of carbon pricing is increasing over time, and currently there are about 75 carbon taxes and emission trading systems in place, covering about 24% of global emissions. What we also see is the increase from 2020 to 2024. There has been an increase by about 10 percentage points. Finally, if we look at coverage across countries, we have to recognize that most of these explicit carbon pricing policies are currently introduced or are implemented in high-income countries, but introduction of carbon pricing in middle-income countries is also on the rise. So then let me go to the first main contribution, the menu, an analysis of the menu of policy tools. So we make a distinction between, first of all, the criteria that countries can apply to decide on what kind of mitigation instruments to use. And what plays a role, of course, is market failures, and what kind of market failures are present is one of the guiding principles to decide what kind of mitigation policies to introduce. Obviously, also fiscal implications are relevant. It makes a difference whether policies generate fiscal revenues or whether actually you need to do fiscal expenditures, like with green subsidies. And finally, also distributional effects are very important. We recognize that there is a central role for carbon pricing in climate change policies, because as we analyze, carbon pricing is the only instrument that implements the polluter pays principle, because you have to pay per unit that you emit with a carbon price. And furthermore, going back to the fiscal implications, carbon pricing does generate revenues that can be recycled for climate action or to soften the distributional effects of climate policy. But nevertheless, it's also crucial to make sure that a just transition is achieved, and therefore it's not going to be sufficient to only channel back, if you introduce carbon pricing, to only channel back the revenues from carbon pricing, but you also need complementary policies like cash transfers or reskilling policies. So then if we go to the carbon pricing metrics, first of all, the definition. You can say that a carbon pricing metric is measuring the price that is paid for each unit of emissions of greenhouse gases. And we make a distinction, or we can make a distinction there between explicit or carbon pricing metrics that measure explicit carbon prices and those that measure implicit carbon prices. Explicit, you can say, is the carbon prices that are introduced with as the very aim to reduce carbon emissions, whereas implicit carbon prices are, for example, related to fossil fuel taxes, or when it's negative fossil fuel subsidies. Then we analyze that there is also a difference between marginal and average carbon prices, and the difference is related to the fact that with average carbon prices you need to take into account that there can be free allowances, for example. And that means that for the last unit you pay a relatively high price, but on average a sector would actually pay a much lower price. So then what are the objectives of these kind of metrics? Why are they so useful to calculate? And why do we spend quite a lot of resources on them? First of all, because they are very informative in analyzing how carbon prices can shift the incentives towards reducing emissions. But secondly, especially if we look at average carbon pricing metrics, they're also informative in analyzing the cross-border spillover effects of carbon prices and the impact they have on competitiveness. So then, if I come to proposals by the task force, we introduce a unified approach to data collection, where we focus on the commonalities across different metrics. And we also analyze that more granular data are needed at the product level. So at the sector level, we do have good information about the level of carbon prices, but if we look at where competitiveness discussions between countries take place, they tend to take place very much at the more detailed product level. And so there it could be useful to collect more detailed data. Then finally, we also have metrics that analyze the impact of carbon prices on emissions. And so we have, for example, the effective carbon price that measures the impact on emissions of carbon prices, but also other pricing instruments. And what is important to mention is that they are based on estimated elasticities or alternatively on economic models, to come to these estimates. So then I will not discuss this into detail, but this table, we think it's quite useful. It provides an overview of the different metrics that the different organizations have to calculate carbon prices. For example, we have the net effective carbon rate, that is the third one by the OECD, which takes into account the explicit carbon price, but also implicit carbon prices like fossil fuel taxes and fossil fuel subsidies. Then if we go one step further, we have the total carbon price, which adds on value-added tax differentials and also uses a different measurement to be able to cover more countries. Finally, if we look at the last one mentioned, that is the carbon price equivalent by the IMF, which takes into account all carbon pricing policies, but also other pricing instruments and also non-pricing instruments to calculate a carbon price that is equivalent in terms of emission reductions to all the policies that are evaluated. Then if we look at the spillover effects, let me see the time. The spillover effects of climate policies, we make a distinction between general spillover effects. For example, the primary spillover effects is that, of course, climate policies, they reduce emissions. And that means that all other countries actually benefit from this. But then, for example, also, if one country introduces carbon policies, it's going to lead to the development of green technologies, and other countries can benefit from this. Then, a third spillover that we analyze is that carbon policies are going to lead to a shift in demand to low-emission goods, which in principle you can say is good, but then economically that also means that countries that are very dependent on fossil fuels, with their production and exports, they are going to be adversely affected. Then if we look more specifically at spillover effects, we make a distinction between production-based policies, such as carbon pricing, and consumption-based policies, where you can say that is carbon pricing together with border carbon adjustments. Because if you add border carbon adjustments, it means that effectively the carbon price becomes not a carbon price that is targeting producers, but you can say it's a carbon price that is paid by consumers regardless of where the product is produced. Yeah, the same holds, for example, with product standards that are applied to goods that are sold in a certain. The point is that if we go from production-based policies to consumption-based policies, for carbon pricing, for example, you would add this border carbon adjustment, and we analyze in the report that there are both pros and cons to border carbon adjustments. So, for example, it helps you better manage carbon leakage. It could help promote political support for the introduction of carbon pricing because of competitiveness concerns. And it can also stimulate a demand for low carbon production abroad. On the other hand, also BCAs can shift the incidence of carbon pricing from industrialized countries to low-income countries that are producing more emission intensity. And as Dr. Bright has already mentioned, BCAs also involve the risk of tit-for-tat trade tensions. So then we also analyze how international organizations could coordinate policies to manage these cross-border impacts. I'm going to go, for the sake of time, go over this relatively quickly. First of all, we can look at a common understanding of the cross-border spillover effects, for example, of this carbon pricing. So we can provide a lot of knowledge to understand better what is driving the cross-border spillover effects. What are the determinants of this? What can we expect if more countries introduce carbon pricing, more countries introduce BCAs? Secondly, it is crucial to get a better alignment of carbon intensity metrics and also carbon pricing metrics, because basically companies that are producing in different countries, they will need to comply with regulations and standards across different countries. And if they are harmonized or at least interoperable, it is going to be much easier to do business. Third, what is important, what we also analyze is technology dissemination, which can really contribute to accelerate the climate transition. And finally, we also analyze that it is important to build on a common understanding of trade-related climate measures, like subsidies for decarbonization or border carbon adjustments. Finally, the last topic that we discuss is how can we coordinate to scale up climate action. First of all, we analyze what the international organizations already do. Yeah, for example, technical assistance or capacity building or climate finance. The IMF and the World Bank are very much involved in this. But then we also analyze that more needs to be done, and we identify 3 different gaps. We identify a transparency gap, we identify an implementation gap, and an ambition gap. And so going into them, focusing on the implementation gap there, we analyze that, for example, countries can try to agree on policies like carbon pricing or agreeing to reduce methane emissions, or they can focus on sectoral measures like, for example, green steel initiatives, or it can be through a mix of policies, and this can also be this kind of implementation, policies that coordination that focuses on implementation can also be based on regional initiatives. Then if we look at the ambition gap, we know what is crucial is to come to enhanced ambition in the NDCs, especially next year at the COP30. And we analyze that this can potentially be done by a subgroup of countries. Although we should make sure that if it is done by a subgroup of countries, it's not going to lead to adverse spillover effects to the countries that are not involved in that subgroup. Then finally, we also discuss what the potential is for the implementation of an approach based on carbon pricing and equivalent policies. Okay, so that brings me to the potential for future work. First of all, and we have a relatively large list, I should mention. So first of all, embedded carbon prices. There, it would be useful to have more data to better determine or to better analyze the competitiveness effects of carbon pricing policies. Secondly, there is still more work to do on measuring the equivalent carbon prices. There is a good framework, I think, but of course it is notoriously difficult to come up with these equivalent carbon prices, so there also more work can be done. Then, if we look at the spillover effects, it is important to do analytical work on the impact of domestic climate policies on other countries, but also on the cost of fragmentation. Yeah, I think we have relatively little knowledge of how costly actually it is that different countries use different regulatory standards when it comes to carbon prices. Then we need to work on green technology diffusion and know-how diffusion. And finally, what we could work on also potentially in the framework of a second report is a comprehensive analysis to compare different approaches to address both spillover effects and to scale up climate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Can I ask you to come up for the panel? Thank you so much for this. And I'm sorry I omitted to say that also UNCTAD was involved in the work. We should ideally have had Chantal Carpentier from UNCTAD here, but she got a last-minute impediment. Yeah, do you find your seats, gentlemen? I think this is actually quite unique, that we have these 5 organizations working together to try to address one of the biggest challenges to our planet right now. This is something that has been discussed all over the world, and everybody's struggling to find the way forward. I would like to ask you, and maybe starting with you, Álvaro, if I may. Countries are obviously, and you mentioned that in the report, struggling on different measures, different tools on how to address climate policies. And you talk about the importance of having a mix. How can you as organization help countries to identify what for them would be the best mix? Mm-hmm.
In a way that we have working together, try to reach. Okay, sorry. I'll start again. So this is a fantastic moment, I think, and we should celebrate, thank our teams, but also celebrate the fact that we have 5 major international organizations getting together with very different perspectives in many ways, and trying to reach an agreement on an issue that is so important for everyone. And that's why I think this is why, because this subject is so important to everyone, that we all got together into this. And I know it's difficult, but it's difficult is good in the sense that means that we bring different perspectives and different types of recipes going forward, but we managed to get a consensus, which I think is quite important. So first, thanks to our team. Second, as you said, Cecilia, I think countries on mitigation and adaptation regulations countries have very different approaches. And in fact, think about, for example, we're just talking about carbon prices. We know that in terms of mitigation, carbon prices in certain countries, some countries really like carbon prices. A good example is Denmark, that wants to have the very high carbon prices so that they fully reflect the externalities. Others, carbon price is a dirty name, right? So you cannot talk about carbon taxes there because it's very difficult. Political economy of carbon pricing in certain countries is extremely difficult. And so the countries work differently. The same thing, some countries, and probably Indermit is going to say this, especially developing countries, they care about mitigation, but they're really worried about adaptation. And so estimating the impacts of the climate adaptation it's going to be extremely important for all of us to address how to go forward. But also on regulation, when you think about deploying renewables, everybody wants to deploy renewables, but you'll be surprised that sometimes to deploy renewables is not as simple. For example, in Ireland, which is an unsuspected country because they care, they want to introduce some interesting policies. In Ireland, if you want to install solar panels in your house, that's fine. You can charge your car with your solar panel, but regulation does not allow you to use a car to power your house, okay? So there are some barriers to the deployment of renewables because we have regulations that were built and were written at the time that we didn't have this issue, and now we do. So going back to your question, countries work very differently and in different ways, and we need to find what's the optimal mix for every single country. What is nice about this work is exactly that when we decide about the policy mix, countries basically balance different economic reality, market failures, and social concerns. And so a comprehensive approach that includes carbon pricing like taxes or ETS alongside non-pricing measures such as regulations and green investments is important. The report, for example, has a fantastic graph which is showing not only that carbon pricing is rising in many countries, but also standards are even rising faster. You can see that standards and regulations are, for many countries, the preferred way to go. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to take into account, and all our international organizations need to work together to increase, as you said, transparency and to improve a better way of carbon pricing, implicit and explicit metrics, and to policymakers to evaluate what's the best way to go forward. On the OECD, one area that we're working very extensively is our inclusive forum carbon mitigation approaches, which right now has 59 countries, but it's expanding, in which we try to, first of all, help the stocktake of the different policies that exist around the world, and try to estimate what are the most efficient ones and what can we do regarding that. We also working on another area that the report highlights extensively, which is carbon intensity metrics. And so we're working try to understand how can we standardize carbon intensity metrics by not only involving industry, but also different governments to share the best practices. So to conclude, and this is what we do in the climate, in the IFCMA, in this inclusive forum, we are trying, first of all, to understand what countries are doing. Secondly, what are the most efficient policies going forward? And especially, how can we enhance multilateral cooperation to address this big challenge? I think this table and this audience shows very clearly that the best way to move forward is to work together. Even though we have different methodologies, different ways of thinking, I think when we are together, we are better, and so look forward to continue working this work.
Well, absolutely, and that's one of the most useful things with this report, that it tries to compare different models and find common standards and methodologies, how to move forward, even if you do it in a slightly different way, how you achieve the same goals. But if I'm a policymaker and I come to you, and I come to the World Bank Group, and I say, can you help me? How can I diversify my mix from my country X? Could you do that then?
Okay, so I was trying to sort of see what this report has accomplished. And I think it has accomplished a lot. So the first one is just putting these four organizations together on one table, I think is a great accomplishment. But I think it's a great way to come to a common understanding. What are the problems, what are the questions, and so on, and what are the deficiencies in the state of knowledge, in the policies, and so on. So that's the first one. The second one, I think it's a great way to set the agenda. I really like the last slide that you put there together. You said there are these issues related to data, related to calculations, related to spillovers, related to the cost of fragmentation of policies, related to the dispersion of green technologies, and to actually put all this stuff together into a common framework. That would be very, very good. And I think it's much better to do this at the beginning rather than one of the organizations coming together with a common framework and then the other one saying, wait a second, that's not the way it, I mean, this is not going to help me talk about this at the country level. It may help you talk about this as a global, or as part of a global audience. The third thing that I really like about this is that we're focusing on the things that really matter, which is emissions, and and try to price the externalities. Because if I think that one of the focus, this thing about renewables, that I don't like that much, because it actually, it basically ends up trying to advocate a corner solution. And as economists, we know that corner solutions are rarely optimal. So this is a good way to do it, we are relatively agnostic about whether or not you cut emissions by going from one fossil fuel to another, or going from a fossil fuel to a renewable. And then I really like, so I really did like the point that you just mentioned, Álvaro, which is that it starts to make you think a little bit, saying, all right, if I really want to sort of raise the price, do I really need to have an explicit price, or can I do this by raising the standards? And I like the way that you put it, that even though prices are rising, standards are rising faster. And actually, our next World Development Report is on standards and development. And I think that we'll actually get into this quite a bit and sort of see whether or not, this may be a sharper instrument, right? Or at least it may not be a sharper instrument, but if you trade it off with how acceptable it is to other countries. And the other point that I keep getting again and again every time we talk about this is the lack of an international ETS. And I think what I really like about this report is that it starts to sort of get you thinking about what that would entail. Now, the last point is that So compared to a lot of other organizations, the comparative advantage of the World Bank, in a sense, is that we tend to sort of aggregate up. So we do our country climate and development reviews, which try to sort of get a balance between climate and development, which is at the center of all of the discussions, debates. But we tend not to sort of start at the top. We actually aggregate things from the bottom, you know. And so we do 26 CCDRs or 30 or 40 CCDRs for the countries that are responsible for, let's say, you know, 50% of emissions or 85% of emissions, or whatever it is. And then when you aggregate it up, it's much easier to sort of get from there to tailored policy. So those are the really nice things about this. The one thing.
But it didn't really answer my question.
Huh? So the thing that I didn't like about this, and I think it's just terminology, was the same thing that you mentioned, because when we use the term climate action for both actions for mitigation as well as for increasing resilience. So I think it's important to sort of really say, you know, working together for better, or essentially, you have to pick a term that actually makes it clear that we are not talking about adaptation like that, because for a lot of countries that's a big part. I did not answer it.
No, you didn't. But
I'll try again.
No, well, wait a moment. We might come back to that.
If you hadn't said that, nobody would have.
No, I think they are. Never underestimate the intelligence of your audience. Ralph, you speak a lot talk a lot in the debate in the report about how spillovers of different politics can have very positive effects on your neighbors and on your partners, but also negative effects. And I think that in WTO you can really see that these tensions are there when we talk about different ways of pricing and so on. I also know that your Director General, Dr. Ngozi, have said, and several other leaders have called for some international carbon border tax, which would be ideal, of course. Could this report and your work help the world getting there if you see 10 years forward?
Thank you, Cecilia, and I will answer your question, I promise. But let me start.
You're allowed to get a cookie afterwards.
Let me start with a broader point in preparation for my answer, and the broader point, which I think is really important to make for us as WTO, is that international trade is actually an important part of the solution when it comes to taking climate action. And as you all know, international trade doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to climate change. Most people, when they think of trade, they think of transport. When they think of transport, they think of transport emissions. They think of the dirty trucks and planes and ships and whatnot. And immediately, you kind of come to the conclusion, well, trade must be bad for the environment. What people don't realize is that transport emissions only account for a small share of overall emissions, and there's large variation in production emissions across countries. So to the extent that you saw something from a relatively green origin, green sourcing, trade can actually be good for the environment. If you start thinking about this as a trade economist, you know, you wonder, well, how does this idea scale up? Because we can't import everything from Switzerland or whatever the greenest country is. And then, you know, you remember your basic theory of comparative advantage, and you realize, well, maybe there's also environmental comparative advantage. Maybe there's also environmental gains from trade. So this is an idea that you know, we've been pushing a lot at the WTO, because you know, we all know that there's economic gains from trade, and the economic gains from trade come from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at. But there's also environmental gains from trade, and they come from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. And the big difference between the two is that these environmental gains need some help, in particular in the form of climate policies that internalize the externalities that cause the problem in the first place. And we've done some simulation that, for example, if there was a worldwide carbon tax, of course, this would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but more than 1/3 of the effect would actually be due to these environmental gains from trade, meaning that trade is an important force multiplier for climate action. So now coming to your question, what this means is that we really have to be careful that climate action or trade-related climate policies do not, or let me put it differently, that international trade in general, and the rules-based trading system in particular, do not become the collateral damage. Not just because that's bad for economic efficiency, but also because we need trade for the very thing that we are trying to achieve. And this is, where the externalities and the spillovers come in, that we really need to be mindful of them, both the positive ones and the negative ones, and try to cooperate to mitigate these tensions. Because, I mean, it's no secret that the different trade-related climate actions that are being taken already are leading to trade tensions. We see this every day at the WTO. You also don't have to be a genius to predict that this is not going to get better, but that this is going to get worse. So I think it's really important, and I'm really grateful, that we could all come together and at least make a first step towards trying to support this process. So I also really wanted to thank the other international organizations for joining forces, and also the team for doing such excellent work. And even though they all did amazingly, I do have to give a special shout out to Eddie Beckers, who I think really did a fantastic job coordinating this, I have to say.
Thank you very much. From the IMF side, of course, you have all the ministers here in town, basically. Do you discuss these issues, and what would, from the IMF point of view, be the most important things to do to sort of step up climate action?
Just wondering, should I answer the question, or should I? But maybe you judge after I sort of speak. And I would like, first of all, also to share others' gratitude for doing this report. I think it's very good that 5 organizations with very different backgrounds, with different mandates, with different focus, talk about these issues and come to common language, common structure of discussing these issues. I think this is really valuable. And what is also strikes me is one of the major conclusions of this report from these different perspectives is that carbon pricing should play a central role in the discussion on climate change, on addressing the climate change. And that is, of course, very common sense economics. Of course, in many countries, climate policy is an upward battle because we subsidize fossil fuels. So what we need is going with the stream, with the tide, in the right direction. So we have to get the prices right. Price signals are really powerful in guiding behavior, and I think the recognition of that in this report is something very important because it comes from all these different directions. So the case for pricing as part of the mix, it's not the only instrument. We also know that. We also have to acknowledge that. It's not the only solution. It's part of the mix, but it's an important part of the mix to get the incentives right. So I think this is really powerful. Economists know this, but of course there's a lot of resistance often against carbon price. Sometimes it's resistant against taxes. But taxes is not the only way to price the emissions. We can also think of emission trading schemes, which in some countries are much more popular. Even in the United States, we can't talk about tax, but 13 states do have emission trading schemes where the emissions are priced. So carbon pricing, and I think that's also very clearly shown in the report, has been increasing tremendously across the world. And I think we have a task as organizations, as economists, to point to the benefits of carbon pricing, to get the prices right, the signals right for the behavior of agents. I think that's the first important point. Now, how do we get, that's your question, to sort of more action internationally? I think it's very good that we have the Paris Agreement, but we also know that the Paris Agreement is not enough. It does not deliver on the temperature goals that we have set. There's many, and Eddie showed exactly what are the implementation gaps, the ambition gaps, so we know this. So we need an additional mechanism to address these issues. And of course, the ideal system, we know, is we could have an ideal uniform carbon price that set all the incentives right. But realistically, we can also think of ways in which we can get there. And One way, for instance, that we have emphasized is that there could be a start with a small group of large players that can take the initiative, can take leadership. If you get the US and China together, that's already half the global emissions. If you add to that India, the European Union, maybe the African Union to also represent the developing world, you have 5 players who can sort of be the leaders in taking this forward. And this could be an important first step. Of course, this agreement should take into account issues like equity, so differentiated responsibilities, which is part of the Paris Agreement. It should take into account issues of climate finance, so COP29 will be very important. And it should also take into account that we need concrete measures to address this. And this is also, the IMF has, for instance, proposed this carbon price floor, the international carbon price floor, which is one way in which to make it more concrete. Then the discussion is more about measures to get there, rather than sort of voluntary contributions. So I think these contours could help shape an international agreement that we really need to make progress.
We could talk about this for hours, I think. I just want to leave some space for questions from the audience. If there anybody who has a question right now, please speak now or remain silent forever. There's a microphone. No? Okay. Then I'll ask which I think will have to be almost the last question. So Eddie, you showed what still needs to be done, right? And how do you think about going forward with this? Because this is, I don't want to criticize this report, it's a very important first tool that you set this together and that all of you and UNCTAD do it together in order to emphasize the gravity, but also trying to find constructive ways forward. How do you go about for the next step? And also then, of course, involving the policymakers. What do you see happening next? You want to start, Álvaro?
I think this is the first step. The second step, certainly, we need to discuss. But I do think that we need to work, first of all, on the metrics, the data, to understand what countries are doing and what not doing. What's the impact of all these policies in how effective are these policies, and learn from each other. So what I think that is quite important going forward, that we work exactly on trying to understand what countries are doing and which sectors, because remember, sometimes when we talk about either pricing or non-pricing measures, we're talking about transportation, energy, and there's many other sectors that are often not involved. In fact, with a great graph in the report shows exactly that per sector, the measures are very, very different from each other. So it's very important that we all work together, we share, and we are able to work together, exactly try to do a stock take of these policies, pricing or non-pricing, but also then afterwards try to understand exactly what are the most effective policies and how can we get there, right? So for example, I think Ruud was mentioning the issue of carbon pricing floor and so on. Listen, I'm an economist, I like pricing mechanisms, and so I'm all in favor. But sometimes it's very difficult to do this for certain countries, right? So certain countries are not accepted. So I think having club of countries potentially doing this might be an interesting approach. I think we need to experiment a little bit. But first step for us is to do these data, these metrics that we don't have yet. And when we have these, we'll be able to help governments as well to design better policies. That's why we've been trying to work with several international organizations in several countries to exactly try to get this type of data. Also try to look at carbon intensity, because carbon intensity metrics are very different from country to country. And in fact, to calculate, just to have standardized the carbon intensity metrics is going to be very important. We just come out with a report in December exactly on this. But we'll be more than happy to work with other international organizations in all these areas so that we get a common understanding and a common methodology going forward, so that we can provide good advice to governments what to do.
Anybody else who wants to? Yes, please.
So I would say what would be a good next step would be, just as this has started to sort of develop a common understanding between these 4 or 5 organizations, I think it would be good to get 4 or 5 countries, especially developing countries, India, and so on, and try to see if we can get a common understanding between these countries about what a carbon credit trading system should look like. You know? So, for example, I was just taking a look at the Indian proposal, right? So the Indian proposal actually has a standard. The plan is not to cover the power sector. So I think this is something that lots of people in India feel like the power sector is actually the biggest polluter. If you exclude it, are you actually serious about this or not? So I think just getting a common understanding about what would be the minimum coverage, you know, that would be a good way to sort of begin to start to standardize things. The other thing, for example, is that so you can also get, for example, you actually get the EU into this. The EU has started to come up with this, but you know, I think that it would be good for the EU to understand that perhaps a similar CCTS, a carbon credit trading system, would look structurally the same, but it might have lower prices. You know, so you know, to the extent that you have lower carbon prices in India to start with, would that be okay? And how does that sort of jive with the problem of essentially making sure that European firms compete on an equal basis? So that's the thing. The last one, I think, is that I think that for many of these countries, the polluter pays principle. It sounds very nice, but at the end, you actually will find that the higher costs of power, for example, once you start to sort of see, are going to be passed down to the consumer, right? And so then the next question is, how do you make sure that you protect the poorer consumers and so on? I think, you know, do you have a mechanism for that? So it starts, as soon as you start to sort of think about all of these things, you start to, you know, it gets into a lot of other things like social protection system, that which many of these countries don't have, you know? But at least I think in general, I think the principle would be, let's come up with 4 or 5 countries and see whether or not we get to a common understanding on that.
Yeah, but Ralph, you want to start?
Maybe
Yeah.
obviously we need to discuss what the next step's going to be, but at least from my perspective, it should be some combination of big ideas and small steps.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the big ideas, certainly from a trade perspective, you know, the main issue that is at least concerning to me, or the main question is, how do we make all these different approaches to climate action interoperable? Because we have, you know, talked about the 75 plus carbon pricing schemes, but then there are also regulatory approaches, the subsidy approaches, and we have to find some way to make them interoperable. And I could imagine, for example, some simulation work that explores a few possibilities and just sees, you know, what the implications would be. So that's in terms of big ideas. In terms of small steps, I completely agree that this measurement work is extremely important. And I like Esther Duflo, you know, has this thing that she says economists need to be more like plumbers. And I think it's really, really like that. You know, it's good to have these big ideas, but at the end of the day, progress is made in small steps. And I hope that a combination of big ideas and small steps is going to get us.
Good.
Thanks. Maybe before we start thinking about sort of new reports, there's so many reports being produced everywhere, and I wonder sort of how much is it read, right? So before doing that, I think we now have a very interesting report that sort of brings together the views from all these organizations. It provides the common language, it provides common understanding, it provides a structure. I think we should also think about how to use that for dissemination. So a panel like this, we can also do for the metrics and discuss, well, what is the different perspectives? And I think dissemination means we have to go out and discuss it with the policymakers, with ministries of finance, So I think there's a lot of value in this report that we should try to exploit by using it, maybe not in the way of sort of writing more, but to have the exchange and have the interaction with people. When it comes to follow-up, I think there's a very nice list, and one of the things that was mentioned is policy evaluation. There's, I think, a lot of models being developed. Many organizations have models. Models are very important to have this structure, to have this framework for the common understanding, for a good discussion. But there's pretty little really empirical evidence, for instance, on carbon pricing. And there's a few sort of good studies on what's the impact of carbon pricing on economic development. And they come out with different results from most of these simulation studies. Why is that? Why don't we have more information about sort of what drives the economic impact of these carbon pricing schemes? So I think that would be my number one, and I think this is on the agenda of many organizations, but I think this group, now that it's got it together, provides a platform for also exchange of this information going forward. So not necessarily a second report immediately, but maybe also think of other ways of exploiting the fact that we have been doing this together.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're at the hour, but I really want to congratulate you and UNCTAD as well for doing this, because your organizations, with your authority and your experience, that you do this together, that you show comparatively what could be done, you try to identify the different methods, you try to come gradually to a common definition and standards and methodology on how to go about is really important. There are reports all over the room for those who are following us online. Can you find the report on your respective websites? Yes? Very good. So you can go into any of those 5 organizations' website. Thank you very much, Ruud de Mooij, Indermit Gill, Álvaro Santos Pereira, Ralph Ossa, and of course to our speakers before. And thank you all for joining us tonight.